Hi, Barbara Boldt. How are you?
I'm great, Michael. Thanks so much for inviting me onto your podcast.
I'm excited for a bunch of reasons. This is Barbara Boldt from BoldtGlobal.com, everybody. She's a communication expert. Before we get going with today's interesting and provocative conversation, I want to remind you, if you're watching the video version of this interview, you can listen to the podcast version on the Talk to Me podcast. It's available on the iTunes platform and the Podbean platform and all your favorites. If you're listening on a podcast format right now, you can watch the video version on the Angelo Caruso YouTube channel. Barbara, I am so impressed with you. I want to begin with a compliment. I saw, and I think I told you this offline, I saw you in an interview, or maybe it was a promo for an interview, and I knew right away you knew what you were talking about. It was so and I don't get that feeling very often from speakers. There's a lot of there are a lot of speakers who are not really carrying their own water when it comes to topics and content. There's a lot of regurgitation. Your stuff is fresh. It's well thought out. I thought it was very interesting, and I wanted to talk to you as soon as possible, man. I'm so glad you're here.
Well, thank you so much. I take that as a high compliment from you, Michael.
I mean it. I mean it. We're going to talk today, everybody, about communication. One of the things that attracted me to you, Barbara, is that you teach non-native English speakers how to communicate in English. I assume your market. Maybe that's not a safe assumption that you're teaching people who are in America or English-speaking countries, but I guess that's not mutual. That's not exclusive.
Actually, I usually am teaching people who are not in America and not in an English speaking country, partially
Okay.
because I lived abroad. I think you know that about me. I lived in Italy and Switzerland. So I'm used to dealing with people who are, not in the UK or not in the States. It's harder for people who don't live in an English speaking environment to get to that clear, effective communication in English because they may not speak it that often,
Yeah.
even if they speak it rather well.
Right. Yeah. How did you come to live in Italy? And oh, by the way, everybody, we're going to get to some really cool applications for this. We're going to talk about more about English and how everybody communicates in English. And this is true for any language, by the way. What happens in the business environment where we become different people and stop acting authentic because we're under a business pretense? What happens? What are the dangers of that? What are the dangers of being too personal in the workplace? Because we all know that's a no-no too. We're going to talk about generational differences in communication, gender differences. Yes, there are gender differences, in my opinion, and really dig down deep into this and find out what's going on um, with language. How did you come to live in Switzerland and Italy? Tell us that, because I know this is a dream for a lot of people.
Yeah, it wasn't actually a dream of mine necessarily, but I ended up taking a vacation. I was at a point in my career back in the early 90s where I was just bored out of my mind. I was in a sales career
Mm.
and I wanted to change interestingly into training and development, but I knew I needed to shake myself up. And I was an exchange student to Japan when I was 17, so I had had this experience.
Which program?
AFS,
Okay.
AFS summer. It was just 3 months.
Okay.
But when I went to Japan, I knew no Japanese. And I knew I could survive in a place where I didn't speak the language. Obviously, I was well cared for when I was in this exchange program. So I had read an article in the Chicago Tribune about renting a farmhouse in Tuscany. I was living in Chicago at the time. And I thought, wow, does that sound like a cool thing to do? So when I made up my mind that I needed this jolt in my life, I decided to go to Italy, even though I didn't speak the language. And I did it in a rather unique way. I'm not a backpacker. I don't like stuff on my back and I don't like unpacking and repacking every day.
Right.
So I rented a flat in Tuscany near this little town called Sinalunga for a month. And I rented a car. And I decided that I would, go out on day trips from there and just explore the area and really get to know the place. My mom thought I was absolutely insane, partially because of how much it was going to cost, but I did it. so yeah, I was in my early 30s, and I flew to Fiumicino in Rome on the 1st of May. I arrived on the 1st of May, which is a holiday in Italy. So first of all, everything was shut. I mean, the rental car agency was obviously open, but everything else was shut. And number two, everybody was going to the beach that day. And my first road out of Fiumicino was to go up sort of the back way to Tuscany instead of the front way. And it was jam packed with cars. So here I am driving in a foreign country, driving a stick shift, which I do know how to do. Had to turn myself around and go back and find the other road, which is sort of more the front way, the bigger highway. Anyway, I got there, I met the landlord. It was an amazing adventure. And I have so many stories from that trip. But basically on the 11th day, going out and about to these various places, I went to this Etruscan museum in a place called Chiusi, which is a resort town kind of. And actually I used to say it choosy because if you don't speak Italian, CH looks like CH in English, and it's actually, the H makes the C hard in Italian. So it's Chiusi. Mm-hmm. Went to the museum. Long story short, I got picked up by this guide. Yeah.
All right.
My mother always said he must have shown me the Etruscan etchings, which is kind of true. He did. In an Italian museum, there's nothing in English. So like I was in this fantastic Etruscan museum, not knowing anything that I was looking at. I didn't know what this stuff was. And so he spoke a bit of English and started explaining things to me.
So he was a consort and a mentor.
Well, sort of. He didn't, his English actually wasn't that great, but it was the first English I'd heard in 11 days. So I was like, oh. And he took me to this other town, and he got the keys to this little tiny, it had been a church, but it isn't a church anymore. And there was this fresco on the wall by a very famous artist. I never would have seen that. But I found out later that he knew exactly what he was doing. So, but that's how I got to Italy. I went back a year later to live with him and see if we could make a go of it. And the short answer to that is we could not. Yeah. So then I ended up in Italy on my own.
Well, first of all, hats off to you. A lot of people do this when they're kids or when they're in their 20s, but to do it in your 30s is remarkable. I mean, it says a lot about you as a person interested in change and discovering new things, meeting new people, this kind of a thing. Bravo. And then you were looking for work and fell into the teaching English.
Yeah, so I studied Italian for the first 6 months. Actually, I went at the end of January. I started Italian at the Università per Stranieri in Perugia in April. So I got a visa for 3 months to study. By the time that visa was up, I was ready to move out of the living situation I was in. I only stayed with that guy for 4 months. So I ended up moving to Perugia, which was about an hour away from where I was living, hour and a half, finding an apartment, and it was a college town. It's one of the most famous Italian language schools in the world, actually. And if you know the story of Amanda Knox.
Oh, yeah.
And Karcher, what was her first name? Bless her heart. The girl who was murdered. That's the town that happened in. I lived in Perugia where that happened, although much earlier.
You were there before Amanda Knox.
Way before, yeah. However, I knew the town, and actually when Amanda Knox happened, I was teaching an exchange classroom north of Milan in a place called Castellanza. And I remember saying to my students, because that was partially communication. If you want to talk about something super interesting, it's how Amanda Knox was perceived by that one prosecutor guy because of how she was communicating and what she was doing. It's fascinating. We don't have to go there.
Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers, and he does a whole chapter on Amanda Knox and how
I need to read that book.
Because she didn't help her own cause, by the way. She did some things that maybe young people do, maybe people under stress do.
Well, and if you've ever seen the documentary about her, it's very, very obvious that the primary prosecutor guy, he was very Catholic and he had 4 daughters. And the things that she did in the beginning of that situation really formed his opinion of her.
Yeah.
And there, in the end, there was very little that could be done to undo it.
Yeah. So in addition to language issues, there's cultural interpretations that happen when you're trying to communicate with somebody and make sense to people.
Oh yeah. And I mean, so I studied in Perugia for 6 months, and then I ended up moving to Milan. No place to live, no job, knew nobody, but I heard about a women's organization, so I planned it so that I would go to one of their meetings. And long story short, I was offered a job teaching English almost immediately because I was mother tongue, and I was also a business. I had a business 10 years in business.
Yeah.
And then ended up finding a place to live. And so I very much, I did the expat experience the hard way.
Yeah.
It was on my own trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Sometimes that makes it, like you said, you got a billion stories. It makes it more interesting.
Yeah, it was fascinating, but painful in moments.
Yeah. And so now you're headquartered here in Michigan?
Yes, I am. I've been back in the States for 8 years.
And so are you doing most of your teaching online? You say that a lot of your clients are still overseas or in other countries?
Well, interestingly, COVID has shown me that my clients should be overseas.
Yeah.
I can work with people from anywhere.
Yeah.
And I'm very happy to work with people in the US. I'm happy to work with people right here in Michigan. But my appeal tends to be to people who are in situations where they don't have an easy way to get better at English or to get better at presenting in English.
So what culture or language are you spending the most time with these days?
I have a French client right now, and actually I'm talking to a second French person about possibly becoming a client. He's an ex-student of mine. He actually took one of my classes when I lived in Switzerland. I'm Italian.
Yeah. Do you do this without, I know you speak Italian, do you speak French?
My French is intermediate. I lived in Lausanne for 6 years, so I do speak some French. But
well, that's interesting that you don't actually need to speak the other person's native language in order to teach that person English. Well,
no, and honestly, you shouldn't, because if the instructor in teaching someone English speaks the mother tongue of the trainee, it's much easier for that trainee because the teacher knows what they're trying to say and will give them a break or help them. So the ideal situation is when the instructor actually doesn't speak the language that the learner's trying to use or learn. Obviously, I've taught a lot of Italians, and I do speak Italian. And I know that I used to do that. I would help them too much, maybe. Yeah. But then in my experience of teaching in Switzerland, I taught in a master's program there for 12 years. And 7 of the years I taught this presentation skills in English class. And I had students from all over the world. I had Chinese, I had Japanese, I had Eastern European, I had Middle Eastern, from everywhere. And people do ask me, so to do what you do, don't you have to speak all these languages? And I'm like, no, because the objective of each of these people is the same. It's to be clear in English. And they will have different challenges around that. It could be accent. It could be the way they're used to creating sentences. It could be vocabulary related. So there are different reasons, but they're all trying to get to the same place, which is to be clear in my mother tongue. So I can help them with that.
So language is mostly about, in my mind, 2 things: vocabulary and pronunciation. Because if you can get those building blocks in place, then you can form sentences. They'd be simple sentences. You'd have to eventually get to verb conjugation and more complicated forms of messaging. But I also find I teach presentation skills to English-speaking people. I find there's a lot of mindset in the mix. Confidence, you can do it, encouraging people to try. Do you find that that's true in your line of work as well?
Absolutely. And I think there's just something about having a clear way of thinking or not. Not everybody's thing is being super clear. They don't, it doesn't come naturally to them.
Yeah.
as mother tongue speakers of English.
Did you ever say to people, I can help you speak English, but I can't help you be clear? That's on you.
Well,
Put that
yeah.
in your agreement.
Well, and like the thing with it, I'll use Italians as the example because I know them very, very well, but Italian is not a linear language. It's what I call tangential. So people start at point A and then they're trying to go to point B, but before point B, they go to C and D and E because something's interesting about that. And so when they try to create clear messages in English, they have to learn to be linear.
So
they have to.
English is a linear language?
English is a very linear language.
Not for
Subject,
some people,
verb, object.
Not for some
well, not
people.
for everybody. And you can find circular speakers, I call them circular speakers, also who are American or British or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's not only that, but an Italian will have been trained to speak that way from their mother tongue.
Right.
So breaking the pattern is harder.
Let's talk about, this is fascinating. Let's talk about the business applications and what happens when a bunch of people that speak the same language come to work and somehow can't communicate with each other. What happens? This may not be your expertise, but I'll bet you got certainly a valid opinion about it. One theory is that there's a lot of pretense in the work world, that we're not authentic. We're role playing. Do you think has merit?
I think that's probably true. If somebody is in an office with a lot of other people, there's status involved. There's who's got control or power over who are you trying to impress or not? Yeah. Where are you in the hierarchy? So all of that definitely comes into the communication space.
In larger companies, you can talk to some people, but you're not really allowed to talk to others. It's like an unspoken rule. For example, you'd never go to your boss's boss to discuss something without your boss's permission.
Right.
And if the org chart is deep enough, you would never talk to somebody way up there because it's just not something that's done. It's
true.
Kind of a bizarre. The Royals are in the news this week, so it's it's like a royalty thing almost, that you don't have the privileges. And what's really bizarre is almost every boss I know says, I have an open door policy.
Right. But nobody has the courage to go through the door or even get to the door.
When you get there, it's not open at all.
Yeah, I have not had a lot of experience working in very large corporate environments as an insider. Yeah. My early career was with Bristol Myers Squibb and Mead Johnson, but I was an outside salesperson. So I haven't ever been in an environment where I've dealt really heavily with that kind of thing. Yeah. But I will say that I do think it inhibits people from feeling that they can speak their truth or be authentic in the workplace. So everything is couched. Everything is, and it's certainly, the post I made this morning on LinkedIn is about using vague language. And it's a block to clarity. Things, stuff, about, sort of, kind of. There's all kinds of these words that don't really carry a precise meaning. Yeah. And possibly in those business circumstances, people use that kind of language as almost a protective device. Like, I don't want to be too factual here because somebody might take offense.
Very much so. The word basically is super overused. When someone uses the word basically a lot, I think they don't know specifically.
Right.
All they speak about is it in basic terms.
Yeah. General terms.
And this mitigated language we see it a lot from, I think I don't know where it came from, but it's a softer, less definitive type of expression. People would actually say, I'm kind of excited. Well, when I was growing up, you were either excited or you weren't.
Exactly.
Kind of like it's on a sliding scale. It was sort of thrilling. I don't get that,
Exactly. That's almost an example of an oxymoron. Yeah. To say sort of thrilling. It was either thrilling or it wasn't.
So when I'm in the front of the room teaching presentation skills, I say, which is it? Because I'm confused my brain is confused about what you just said.
Right.
Take a stand, man. Was it thrilling or was it not thrilling? And if it wasn't thrilling, don't use the word thrilling.
Right. Or don't use the word sort of.
Thrilling.
Yeah. And I think Right. So that's forcing the person to make a different choice about the main word they're really choosing. Is
Yes.
it appropriate or not? Is
Yes.
it precise or not?
Right.
Yeah. And
So
this
back to
also,
vocabulary again.
absolutely. And also this sort of kind of maybe a little bit kind of language takes us to that gender place.
Yeah.
Because in my experience, it's more common that women will use these fillers
100%.
and it's diminishing. I call it diminishing language.
100%. It's like speaking in questions, like you're never
Yes.
sure of yourself. Also diminishing. Now, I'm going to get mail on this interview, and you will too. But here's how I defend the mail. MAIL, uh, not the M-A-I-L.
MAIL.
Um, you used an interesting phrase earlier. You said it was referenced something about people speaking their truth, which is
Mm-hmm.
another phrase that wasn't around when I was growing up. Um, when I was growing up, there was one truth, you know, snow is white, right? Rain is wet. There was no argument about this stuff. But now everybody's got their own journey. That's another new thing to the lexicon,
Mm-hmm.
their own truth. And I'm okay with truth being interpretive. I mean, it's the American judicial system is founded on that, right? That witnesses can see an event and interpret it in different ways. That's their truth, and they get on the witness stand to tell their side of what they think they saw. I
Mm-hmm.
understand how this works. The challenge becomes then when people are communicating, say, in a business world about something that, like a fact, we were just talking about, do women tend to use mitigated language more frequently than men? There's research on it.
Mm-hmm.
Data points, all you letter writers. Some attorneys would call it proof, you know, that women have certain patterns in there. Not all women, by the way, but enough
No,
to
not
show
all.
a pattern. Um,
Well,
and
and
it's
it's not
okay.
only in English that it happens. I'll throw in a cultural caveat here. I once read that Japanese women have to use 30% more words when they're trying to express themselves because of all of the times they have to apologize.
Oh my.
Yeah, I know the words for apology in Japanese to this day. I mean, many, many years ago that I was there, but it's gomenasai and sumimasen. And women in Japanese use these constantly.
Yeah.
It's because, sumimasen, gomenasai, can I say something here? Is it okay?
Yeah.
So in our culture, that kind of thing happens too. I would agree that it's not every woman, and women who have worked on their confidence and power and have learned to cull these words from their vocabulary
Right.
don't use them.
Right.
But it is a tendency.
And there are men who soften their language and maybe make their position less clear by using mitigated language. These qualifiers like sort of, kind of, you know,
Or
about.
maybe, like maybe we should take this course of action.
Yeah.
Well, should we take this course of action or shouldn't we?
Yeah, because when you leave off the word maybe, it becomes more of a directive or an instruct,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Which can serve you better if you're trying to curry influence with a committee, for example, a group of people.
And it becomes a suggestion, doesn't it?
Yes.
If we say maybe we should do this, it's a suggestion as opposed to a directive. Yeah,
It's like you're soliciting buy-in or permission.
for sure. So there's a place for that. Yeah,
How about this one? I bet you don't like this one either. Can I ask a question?
right.
Same thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, it weakens the asker.
Yeah.
For
Now
sure.
there are, if a bunch of people are talking and you need to interrupt, I think it's
Right.
appropriate to say, excuse me, may I offer some input, which is similar kind of a phrase. But that's etiquette, you know, that's not going to hurt you or take points away from your
Right.
argument.
It's better than running people over to interrupt them.
100%, yeah. So you mentioned gender, and this of course happens in the workplace. We know there's still very much a glass ceiling for women in the workplace. There's a huge push right now in a bunch of organizations and companies about inclusivity and and uh, what are these, diversity, you know, all
Diversity and
these ways
inclusion.
to kind of
Mhm.
level the playing field. But my opinion is that it seems to me that women, as an example, and we can talk about other groups the same way. Maybe we'll get to millennials in just a second, because you could make an argument for every demographic. Even white males have issues, God knows. But in a workplace, do you think it would be good if women could somehow stop using this type of mitigated language and speaking in questions and
yeah,
deferring, these deferential kind of mannerisms that they have? In Japan, I guess you could never say to Japanese women, stop apologizing so much, because it's cultural. Maybe our issues here are cultural as well.
well, I think in Japan, probably that has changed over the last 40 years. Japanese women may use less apologetic language than they did back in the day. So
Yeah.
that may have moved on.
Okay.
I think what's tough for women, so there are all kinds of things that go into this. And one of them is corporate culture, what's acceptable, and what comes down from the top as being the way we communicate around here. And is it a more masculine style of communication, or is there room for alternative ways of communicating? A feminine style would be one, but people of color have other ways of communicating as well. So how much space do you leave in that corporate environment for alternatives in the communication style? That's one thing that occurs to me in this circumstance.
Yeah.
Women, another big thing that plays into this is intonation pattern. Because if you've got the sort of kind of a little bit stuff going on, plus you're ending a lot of your sentences in an up intonation. My name is Barbara Boldt. My company is Bold Global, right? That's a questioning intonation that further undermines people's credibility.
Yeah.
When they're speaking.
It's hard to be an authority when you're never declarative, when you're always
right
asking the question. I agree 100%.
And this is something that non-native English speakers struggle with, because like from Italian, French, or Spanish, they're used to much longer phrase construction. So I have a whole handout on this actually, that they don't use full stops nearly as often as we do. They use the semicolon. So they're used to thinking more than one idea in a phrase, like it goes on and it goes on. So when they speak in English, they're using up intonation because in their mind, they're not done yet. They're not finished with their idea. So they stay up on the intonation, and you have to teach them.
Well, we see that in English as well. People putting ideas forth in meetings and stuff, where they just seem to be working it out in real time, which I appreciate. I do that sometimes myself. But if you really want to seem like you have it together, it seems like there should be a beginning and an ending to your sentence.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, it's going to be hard for people to. It depends, I guess, if you're in a white paper or a blank sheet kind of conversation, or if you're supposed to be presenting ideas in whole cloth. I don't know.
Oh, for sure. I mean, in a brainstorming context, you could see somebody having that less directed type of conversation out loud, just to put the ideas out there and get people's input. But if you're trying to get buy-in on something, which is frequently the case, people need buy-in. They need people to take an action or engage with them. In that case, the declarative or that full stop at the end of the phrase is going to be far more effective.
So if a large percentage of the population in the United States wanders and doesn't finish their sentences and uses mitigated language, why does this part of the population do it? What's the core issue here? Are we going back to the brainstem and psychology types of maxims? Is it a confidence thing? Is it
I think it's in some cases, I mean, I don't know, because this isn't actually my core area of expertise, but I would say that we've become lazier communicators over time. And I noticed some of this when I moved back to the States after having been abroad for 19 years. The language had obviously moved on without me. There were things that I was just like convinced that they were dead wrong. And my brother's like, get with it. You know, you just have to get used to this, because I mean, I have grammatical examples that I could share. But we do, I think texting coming in is part of it as well. The abbreviations and the emojis and those kinds of things mean that we don't have to be as specific as when we speak.
Yeah.
And yet our brain doesn't get the emoji necessarily in the same way.
Well, and on the other side of the equation, because the equation, like communication is like an equation, it has to balance. On the other
Right.
side of the equation, we expect the other person to do all the spade work.
Thinking, exactly, trying
Figure it
harder to
out.
understand our message.
Here's the emoticon. Figure out exactly how I'm feeling. Right.
Well, and the interesting thing is, and I actually put this in my blog post or my LinkedIn post today, in other languages, this is the way it works. We call it in-group, out-group, implicit, explicit communication. English is an explicit language. Traditionally, we have had to spell things out because of the diversity in our country.
Yeah.
In a country like Italy or Japan is the ultimate example of high context or implicit communication. People can read each other's minds.
Well, Japan is an island.
Yeah, well, Japan's an island. It was closed to the outside world for 250 years. There are all kinds of reasons for this.
Yes.
But like when I was living in Italy, I spoke Italian extremely fluently. My Italian was really good. I very grammatically correct, actually. But I would be at dinner parties where I would be the only American. I'd be the only Anglo. And so the whole conversation was happening in Italian. And I would realize at a certain point that I was no longer with them. They had made a jump, and I hadn't made the jump with them.
Yeah.
And it took me years, literally, to figure out that it wasn't something that I had not understood. It was something they had never said. Everybody but me at the table knew the offhand reference, or, could just go to this other part of the conversation because of something that was common knowledge and assumed in the room. And I was the outsider, and I didn't get it.
That's a fascinating thing about communication too, because we're still in the workplace in this part of our conversation, that someone would complain to the boss about another workmate and go on and on about she does this or he does this, to the boss. And the boss listens for like 12 minutes and says, well, have you talked to him? And the person goes, no.
Right.
Because of things that were never said. And what happens when you stop getting along with your neighbor next door? I don't know why I'm pointing over here. I like this guy. But when you stop talking to your neighbor, you just give up. Both sides throw in the towel. He's an asshole. I can't be troubled with this anymore. And then you don't talk to him for 4 years or 14 years.
And something could have changed in the meantime.
100%, which is what I'm hoping people will get out of our conversation today, that if you're listening to this conversation, you need to be the better person. You need to be the one that extends the olive branch. Somebody once told me that a good marriage is not 50-50, it's 60-60.
Right. You've always got to be the one who's willing to make the overture.
Yeah, for sure.
That's really true.
So we're still in the workplace. Let's talk about generation gaps, because the millennials are just being themselves, but it's causing a stir among the older folk.
Yeah. It is, and I've read that the older folk just need to get used to it. And I'm an older folk, so.
So I think this is happening for the first time in this way. There's always been a younger generation. The younger generation has always been slackers. We didn't always call them that, but they've always not worked as hard as the generation prior. The work
in the mind of the prior generation, yeah.
And I'll tell you that about my parents. They could work in ways I can't work today.
Right.
But and I don't have children because I wanted to put a stop to that.
I don't have children either.
My kids will never say that about me. But what I find fascinating is that that I think it's because of technology and this thing, this love now with our devices, and so we stop communicating like humans. And it's causing problems for this generation in ways that previous generations did not have to cope.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think one of the biggest impacts of that is, and they say this, I don't have direct evidence of it, but that younger people are less comfortable with face-to-face interaction.
Oh, I
with
think
that
tons of data points on this as
personal conversation, right? And they'd rather text it. Or so it's the removal somebody might not like what I have to say. I'm going to test the water with a text, right? That kind of thing, instead of directly communicating with who you need to communicate with.
Well, it's more than testing the waters with the text. Text is preferred over
Yeah.
actually dialing, and a little anachronism there. We don't dial the phone anymore, everyone.
No,
Dialing the phone, at some point we're going to stop saying that. I should stop saying
we
that.
should say Rolodex too. That's the other one we have to
Thank
drop.
you. But using the people of a certain age, right? But instead of actually using the telephone to make a call, they would text.
Yeah,
People come to pick me up instead of calling me or knocking on the door. They text me, I'm here. I'm like, well,
yeah.
come in.
And I do that with my partner when he has to come out and help me carry in the groceries. But I did just think of an interesting example that happened to me a couple of years ago. I had inadvertently insulted a younger woman, a woman of color, actually, who, it was a whole thing that I learned about hair, African American women in hair. And I don't want to diss that at all. It's a thing. And I didn't realize it. So it was a huge educational experience for me. But the young woman that I was in this interaction with was in her 20s, mid to late 20s. And I became aware that I had caused an issue. I wanted to apologize, and I wanted to speak to her to apologize. She didn't feel that a call was necessary, and we worked the entire thing out by text.
Wow.
Because that's what she was comfortable with. She's like, at one point she actually said to me, or texted to me, I don't need to have a conversation about this. We can deal with this on text. And I was feeling very incomplete with the situation because I hadn't heard her voice and she hadn't heard my voice. When you're trying to apologize for something, or you want to apologize, part of it is tone. Part of it is not what the words, but the way I'm saying these words. And she missed all of that, but also interestingly, apparently didn't feel the need for that.
So here's the unfortunate part, and I feel you because a parallel story and then our mutual conclusion. I work with a young person on a committee, terrific young lady, and there are 10 of these young people on the committee. I'm kind of like the senior member of the group, looking over the group, that kind of a thing. And she's the only one that won't return my calls. And I've just come to the conclusion she doesn't like to talk on the phone. She will do anything to not be on the phone,
Right.
which is her prerogative, right?
Right.
But here's the challenge. Because we don't talk on the phone, I know we're going to have more misunderstandings than the people I'm actually allowed to communicate with.
Right.
So she's euchering me. I don't know if you remember the card game euchre. She's
I don't know how to play
it. Into her situation. I've got an old saying, I'm about to do a blog post myself about it, which is that the weaker person tends to control the relationship. So and it's not so that because I feel it necessary to label her as weaker. It's like she's removing communication tools from our relationship. And I know those tools are helpful to both of us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So the mutual conclusion to all this is sometimes you just have to roll with it. You have to honor people for where they want to be, even if they're making bad choices about how they're handling, say, delicate scenarios. I mean, your snafu was about hair, but it could easily have been about something deeper or more.
Hair's pretty deep, actually, I found out. However, I mean, I had deeply offended this woman, and I did it unintentionally. I didn't know that I had deeply offended her. But that brings up the point. It's one thing to allow that level of communication to go on, like only texting or not being comfortable on the phone, if the stakes aren't super high. But when we get into situations where important decisions need to be made, or the stakes are really pretty high, in my view, at that point, somebody has to take control of the situation and say, there's going to be a phone call here, because we need to be absolutely sure that we're clear. So
think about marriage and divorce and how couples talk about major things at stake, all those assets, the children.
Right.
and they stop talking to each other because they just given up.
Yeah.
It's easier to not talk than to try to work it out, to not have counseling, or to have that. What was the book a while back? Crucial Conversations, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you hear about people getting told that they're going to get divorced by text. I mean, I think,
Yeah.
or breaking up, or, and then there's the whole phenomenon of ghosting, which is another topic, but
Crazy.
yeah.
Let's talk about ghosting while we're still at work. I read an article, very interesting article in the paper. It could have been the Wall Street Journal. It could have been the New York Times. They try to provide attribution. And the article was about the benefit or penalty of anonymous suggestion boxes.
Mm-hmm.
What happens when employees are allowed to complain, essentially, because the suggestion box is never a compliment.
It's a complaint box. Yeah.
What happens when they're allowed to complain or comment without signing their name to it? And the research is interesting that you get a lot more vitriol because people can't be held accountable. You won't even know who said it. I mean, we used to play this game as kids at the drive-in, at the hamburger stand, McDonald's, whatever, because you could riff on the lady at the window at the speaker. I'm old enough to remember when this thing was invented, the drive-through.
Oh yeah.
We had a ball with that lady at the speaker, but when we got to the window, we started to realize this was the same woman preparing our food. We better be nice to her, She made.
Don't riff too heavy.
So that anonymity was rewarded at the window when we could have our fun, but when we got to look at her face and she didn't appreciate our humor, then there was penalty for it. Mm-hmm. And workplaces are finding out the same thing. I remember I did a gig one time in Alaska for a healthcare system. It was way up in the Arctic Circle.
Cool.
And the way I tell the story, that people would say, "Where's Kotzebue?" I say, "Here's the globe. Here's the bracket. Here's the bracket that holds the globe on at the top. Kotzebue is underneath that bracket." That's how high up it is.
That's high. So
I'm doing all these interviews, the equivalent of customer sat surveys with the people that work at the hospital. And one of the women had and they shared with me what was in the suggestion box. And somebody, I don't know if it was a woman, but somebody had complained that the hospital owed this person back pay. And it was anonymous.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
How are you ever gonna, right? In electricity, there's a thing called the closed circuit where, the current goes all the way around. It's like communication should go, two-way communication. I talk to you, you talk back to me. Mm-hmm. In nuclear codes, it's called not a repeat, a three-peat. We're going to DEFCON 1. You go, got it, we're going to DEFCON 1. And then I go, yeah, you got it, that we're going to DEFCON 1. That's complete communication, right? Careful communication. Mm-hmm. But this anonymous thing, there are plenty of HR people that say that you have to create a safe space for people to communicate. Otherwise they won't communicate with you at all. You have to make them feel safe.
Absolutely.
It's a complicated web that we weave, right? Because now you have this anonymous feedback and you can't have that real dialogue. You can't actually get to the core of the problem, which is flaws in the relationship.
Well, and I think it even goes deeper than that, this idea of creating a safe space. If you don't have safe communication in your corporate environment or wherever, you're never going to know what the heck is going on because nobody's going to feel free to tell you. Mm. So that's very, very bad. And the other thing that's tricky about that is that safety is defined differently by different people. Yes. One person might feel safe in an environment and another person will not. And of course, as we know, it's often women or people of color who don't feel as safe because of all of these factors that go on. But I learned this lesson the hard way, teaching at the University of Michigan. I was accused of creating a hostile classroom in this class that I was teaching. And I was totally taken aback by this feedback because I don't consider myself to be a hostile person. No. And yet my way of giving feedback to the students was perceived as hostile. It was too direct. And
so their truth was that you were hostile. Your
Right.
truth was, I have no idea what this person's talking about.
My truth was, I'm trying to teach you something.
And maybe
No?
the real truth is somewhere in the middle. Maybe, I don't know.
Well, I realized, and actually my family had sent me an article about that same time about some research that was being done in, I think it was San Diego, by a researcher on the Y generation, and even the youngest, the people that I was dealing with at the time who were in their early 20s, late teens, early 20s. They not only need to feel physically safe in a space, they need to feel emotionally safe.
Yeah.
So, how do you create that emotional safety? And that was new to me. I had not ever been in a teaching context where I needed to think about creating emotional safety.
Yeah.
But that in workplaces and schools today or universities, that is a factor. And you always have to be thinking about how what you say can be taken, but then that puts incredible constraints on what we actually say,
For sure.
right?
For sure. Well, I get evaluated at my talks all the time. You probably do too. Uh, and I've learned I can't please everybody in the room. I rarely
Right.
do. Uh, do the people that say bad things about me or unpleasant things about me get my attention? Yes. Do I go home at night and worry about it? No. Do I try to become a better person and a better speaker? Yes. Look, I think all opinions are useful. I'm going to get mail for this one too, but I don't know that all opinions are equally valid.
Well,
An
that's definitely
uneducated, unworldly, insecure, damaged person, and I don't say damaged in a pejorative sense. I mean it in a factual sense. They were not raised in a nurturing home. They lack self-confidence. They suffer from low-level paranoia, and they come into your classroom and criticize your teaching technique based on things that happened to them when they were 5. Doesn't make them right.
no, it did get me fired, but
Oh my
that's
goodness.
the downside of that, that what can happen. And it was there were other circumstances involved. It wasn't only that, it was partially the way the department I was
Oh, but we
teaching for
know in a
handled it.
cancel
But
culture, people do get, there is serious penalty, especially if this thing gets a roll, right?
absolutely, there are very serious penalties. In debriefing that whole episode in my career, I now know that part of my problem was that I had not anticipated the difference in culture in an American university classroom as opposed to a European university classroom. And all of my academic teaching had been in the European context.
Yeah.
So I was a victim of my own blind spot there of, I teach culture, and yet whap, I got blindsided by a
Yeah.
cultural difference.
My point is that you mentioned you don't like to carry things on your back. There are only so many things that you can be personally responsible for. And I do believe, by the way, that the instructor, the teacher, me in some cases, I'm responsible for everything that happens in that room.
Absolutely.
But am I
I
guilty of
agree.
all the things I'm accused of? I don't think so. Example,
Right.
um, your method of teaching is to ask questions of the group to make sure they did their homework or that they understand or to further the conversation or even just to involve the wallflowers in the room. But one of the wallflowers takes umbrage at this approach and thinks you're trying to single him out and embarrass him. And he files a complaint.
Right.
And then what you hope is that that single complaint is a drop in the bucket compared to all of the compliments that you received and accolades from students who are high achievers and appreciate the interrogative Socratic method of teaching.
Right.
It's complicated, right?
It is. And you're absolutely right that you're not going to make everybody happy. What shocked me was that some people in the room felt that I was, doing them harm. And that was not at all my intent, but it was the perception. So it's that whole thing about perception and always having to be aware in a circumstance of how someone's experience is going to lead them to perceive our behavior in a certain way.
We'll leave business now and go to the royal family.
Oh my goodness.
The news this week, everybody, is that, and you may be watching this recording sometime after this happens, but Harry and Meghan, who have been essentially ostracized from the royal family in England, did an interview with Oprah and outed the royal family for bullying type treatment and that sort of thing. You can watch the interview if you care about this kind of thing. The statement from the royal family was an interesting bit of language. The statement from the royal family was, "We are saddened to learn, we are saddened to learn," something like the depth of their experiences. It was an interesting form of, it wasn't a mea culpa, it wasn't an apology, it wasn't an admission of guilt. It was like an impact, but it had a lot of empathy. Like, we're sorry to hear that they've had a rough time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Which,
like they didn't know it.
As a language person, I kind of liked it, you know. I'm not interested in holding the royal family accountable for anything. It's not my place. I'm not one of those people that judges people I've never met before and situations I'm not involved with. I don't have enough information. But as a clinician of the English language, I thought it was artistry the way they responded. Now there'll probably be more come out about it. There are people that want the royal family to apologize. I don't know what happened, but it's interesting how we handle apologies in various ways, right? The non-apology apology.
Right. I mean, I basically had to apologize to that classroom. And I thought very carefully about what I said, because there's a fine line between apologizing for something and diminishing your authority.
Do you remember what you said?
I don't. I actually don't remember what I said at this point. However, it was heartfelt. I felt that it was important for them to understand my, what had been or not been my intent, and that I was sorry that some people had been offended. I think other people in the room were sort of wondering what this was all about, because their perception was totally different. But I felt that it was important to say something to move forward, so that, from here on out. And I went and got feedback from the pedagogy department. I made changes in my way of teaching in that room, which was noted at the end of the semester by some people.
Yeah.
But it's a tricky position to be in. And language, like you and I are both language people. One of the things I wrote last week was about, it was Tuesday, assumptions, the assumptions that impact how our message is received and how our message is given as well. They're invisible, but they're shortcuts. And it's in some ways it's a lazy, it's not the only reason we might be impacted by assumptions, but part of it is that lazy communication thing, not thinking too carefully about who you're speaking to, not thinking about their experience, and not thinking how your words might land.
Yeah.
And I do think, talking about the business context or whatever context, we have to be super careful with language. And you might agree.
I do agree. I don't think it's just laziness, although I think there's there's a lot of laziness. We're also operating at hyper speed these days,
Yeah.
Quick responses, unedited retorts, just torrents of language sometimes when we lose it. It's called a rant, right?
Well, and that's, and that's riskier verbally, isn't it? When it's written communication, we can take that day that we need to calm down.
That's the time issue, because writing it, this is the best advice of all the psychologists and everybody, anger management. Put it in writing, because that slows it down, right?
Yeah.
And that allows you to choose your words more carefully, right? Take a breath, sleep on it. Don't send the angry email as soon as you write it, click send, Let it sit in the box for a minute in a draft format. And in 100%, you go back and you change it, you soften it. And I do the same thing with the redhead here. I'll write something and I'll say, would you read this for tone? She knows right away what I'm asking.
Right.
And she almost always softens it for me, offers that last bit seems harsh. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I change it, sometimes I don't. Often I change it because I don't want to make the water murkier. I'm trying to clean up the water, clear it up. Let's
Yeah,
find
I
out.
often rewrite emails. I rewrite them very frequently.
Yeah, I think it's a best practice for sure. Let's end up with perhaps the most dramatic version of communication in our society today. Save the best for last, everybody. And it combines some of the elements of what we've talked about so far with power exchanges and gender issues. And of course, I'm referring to the Me Too movement. And I watched, have you seen The Morning Show? This little mini series with Jennifer Aniston and Steve Carell.
I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it.
It's essentially the Matt Lauer story, but it's
Okay.
disguised, but it's close. It's very close, I imagine, to what he went through. I don't know Matt Lauer. I don't know that situation. I only know what I read in the paper. Very unpleasant. Most of you know how this narrative works. There's a female who perceives herself as a victim. It's often happens over a period of time. She decides that I can't stand it anymore. I have to speak my truth. She outs the offender. The offender either offers an apology that's either qualified or straight up, sometimes a straight up denial. But how many times are we going to step in this cow pie before we figure it out? That's my question.
Well, the interesting thing is we have a recent experience here with Andrew Cuomo.
Yeah.
Which
current.
I don't know if anybody heard his apology the other day, but it certainly rang insincere to me. Just hearing that.
It wasn't an apology. He was digging in.
Yeah, he was digging in, but the tone of it. And this is why intonation is so critical in communication.
Well, Cuomo is Italian.
Sì, lo so, però. I don't know that he speaks the language. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. I think the worst thing that someone in his position or in Matt Lauer's position or whatever position it is, when you're called out or you're accused or whatever the case might be, I don't know if Cuomo spoke too soon or what the case is. I don't know why, but his intonation simply was very disconnected from what he was saying. There was an absolute,
Yeah, and not to defend him because I know nothing about whether this happened or didn't happen, whether it happened multiple times or only one time, I don't know. But the context of it was that he resigned because of the accusation, first one accusation, and now I think there are three.
Mm-hmm.
And in our society, by the way, and this started way back with Cosby, that the more allegations there were, the more guilty you were, whether there was actually a judicial trial or not. Now, Cosby was tried and sent to prison. And his situation was I assume, much different than Cuomo's, much different than Matt Lauer's. A lot of times the guy will say, we're going to get to communication here in a second because it all comes back to communication. All these guys had different situations, but it's roughly cut from the same template every single time, which is the man took advantage of the woman. So there was a psychologist a while back, you probably know the name, Albert Ellis, and he founded this thing called REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy. And his big thing, in short, everybody, was that what we think about determines how we feel, and how we feel determines our behavior to a great extent, right? So he was the guy that established that linkage. It's his big claim to fame, and I believe in it. I do think there is a relationship there.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, and it comes out in the show, the morning show, you all can watch it to see, it's very, very well done. It introduces, Barbara, the nuance that we've tried to introduce to our conversation today, that it's not so simple sometimes, it's not so clean cut. There's context and interpretation and history, right? Baggage,
backstory, absolutely.
So the question becomes, how can we tighten up that communication loop so that if a man says something stupid, which men are known to do, that first of all, he communicates with himself better, in the early going and stops being a buffoon, that the woman shuts the door sooner than maybe some women are shutting the door right now. Back with Harvey Weinstein, again, no, not defending the guy, but one of his chief what's the word? Elegance?
Defenses?
One of the chief people that had alleged and then
accusers.
proven that she had been raped multiple times by Harvey Weinstein at his place.
Right. And so there are all kinds of things that play into that. Yeah. Obviously, power.
Doesn't make him any less guilty. In fact, it makes him more guilty.
No, it certainly doesn't make him any less guilty, but it doesn't make her any less guilty either. I mean, it's the vulnerability aspect. I mean, and that isn't just about language, but
or gender.
No, well, it's complicated. It's very, very complicated. What is said in those circumstances, and then, how the accusations are made, all of that is, I think it's more complicated than we can even talk about here. But I do think it's all about attitude. If somebody who perpetrates that kind of violence against another person has issues.
Yes.
There's something in their makeup that either they're on a power trip or whatever it is. So that connection that you spoke about, what you think affects what you feel, which affects how you act, that really describes a lot of that stuff.
Yes.
And also, the authenticity. I was trying to somehow tie in Brene Brown here, because I do think that whole empathy piece,
yes,
of being able to put ourselves in another person's shoes.
Yeah, because if you were a decent guy and you were in a situation with a woman and you could sense what she was feeling, which is the definition of empathy, you wouldn't go through with it unless you were a bad person, in which case you deserve whatever happens to you later on. But
that's one way of putting it.
The confusion happens when you're not paying attention to what's happening, or you lack empathy, or you are a buffoon, right?
Well, perpetrators.
Alcohol's involved a lot of
the time. Yeah, that's true.
Which murks up everybody's judgment and causes. Gladwell talks about this in Talking to Strangers. He even talks about how alcohol works its way through the brain. It starts in the cerebellum. It eventually gets to the hippocampus, which is blackout stage, and how at every stage your judgment becomes more impaired. First your balance, then your judgment, then your consciousness.
Right. Yeah. And what people say under the influence is often not in their control.
That's right.
For sure.
It's in all the books. The first thing that you lose with the first cocktail is inhibition. Hello.
For sure, which helps some people in some circumstances and doesn't help in other circumstances.
Right.
But I think that
if you're with a safe person, probably nothing bad is going to happen. But if you're with an unsafe person, God help you. And God help.
Well, I think in that case, we have to say, would anything that you said make a difference? It's like, right. At that point, communication is kind of out of the window in that regard. But right. I think where you were starting with this part of the conversation about, one of the things you said to me offline is, can men compliment women anymore? Or is it always going to be taken negatively? Is it always going to be taken badly? Yeah, that's unfortunate.
If I may adjust that, I don't think it's always taken badly.
Not always.
I just think it's cloudier than it used to be. Right.
Well, I think men walk on eggshells in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
Possibly.
I know I've stopped hugging women.
Right. Not only because of COVID. Yeah.
Not because of COVID. It just became too, I didn't want to be that guy. Even if I wasn't that guy, I didn't want to be perceived as that guy. So I pulled back.
Mm-hmm.
This is my problem, everybody. I appreciate all your concern. I'll work it out somehow. But think about how language has changed as we wrap up here, Barbara. Cuomo's been accused of sexual assault. But to my mind, he's not nearly on the level of Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah, I don't know enough about that whole situation to make the comparison.
But here's the
One,
point. It doesn't matter how you define assault. If the woman says that you assaulted her, that's the framework that we start working from.
if the word assault is used, you mean?
Yes. And
If
the
it's
word assault
nominated.
now applies to a bunch of languages changing, right?
Yeah,
People stop saying you're welcome. And assault is any unwanted sexual advance, kisses, touches, and all the other more extreme stuff. So
right. I mean,
I guess
but who draws that line?
that's right.
Who creates the definition of assault in that case? And it sounds like you're saying that it's the female side of the equation that's using the word, and then it takes on the definition.
Well, we're learning something, right, from females who are educating us on what they are willing to tolerate, what's good for them, what they don't want. Uh, this is what communication is about. It's about learning from each other, and I think there's going to be a lot of dialogue and articles written and books written about this before we figure it out, if we ever figure it out.
Well, and it's also about people feeling free to speak up, feeling it's that permission or that open space to feel free and feel vulnerable enough to be able to to speak your truth.
Yes. So hopefully, in this conversation, we've offered enough insight and strategies for uh, sharpening communication skills if you want to get better at this. And I think all of us can be better at communicating. And it's the
Absolutely.
only way we're going to navigate these challenging topics and things that are happening.
Well, and there's the whole, and we're not going to go into this today, but there's the whole other conversation of the divide and not being able to speak across the divide, the political divide that we have in the country right now.
Yes.
So it's emotional charge. There's so much. One of the things that I realized when I lived abroad, and then this really, it goes kind of back to that business context and feedback. As Americans, we tend to take things very, very personally.
Mm.
In German culture, for example, or British culture also, they can have an intellectual conversation about politics or religion that doesn't devolve into something personal. And
Yeah.
I'm obviously I'm generalizing here. Maybe that happens sometimes also in those cultures. But in the US, we have this tendency to feel attacked if someone purports a different opinion than we have or a different point of view. And that's something I think as a society we need to examine, because it's dangerous and it creates this barrier to understanding
Right.
and
Well,
really communicating.
if you think about, all of us have a sensitivity setting, a thermostat. And if we all set our thermostat to hypersensitive, we're never going to be able to talk to each other about important things.
Right,
The fear
absolutely.
of offending, being accused of something, uh, encouraging someone not to feel safe, you know, and and I don't know what the answer is. I don't know. I have more questions about this stuff than I have answers. But it's been such a pleasure talking with you, because this is really a good forum to, I think, for people to learn. And I'm very interested in reading comments about what people think. And Barbara Boldt, everybody, uh, I think is a fantastic person. She's a great communicator. It's Barbara Boldt, Boldt, BoldtGlobal.com is the website. She's all over social, which is where I discovered her. I hope we can do more things, Barbara, and I look forward to seeing you on the speaking platform when things open up.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Michael. It was a pleasure, and I hope people get benefit from our conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you.